Hi, everyone. I'm Aaron Good. And before we kick off Devil's Chess Club, I want to talk about an important new documentary series called Four Died Trying. The series will be available starting November 22nd on Apple TV, Google Play, Amazon, Journeyman, and the fourdiedtrying.com website. John Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Robert F. Kennedy. In the last years of their lives, each of these men joined an unprecedented struggle to end war, poverty, and injustice. Besides a common cause, did they share a common enemy? Does the world created by their brutal murders persist even today? Do the forces that destroyed the hopes of a generation only grow more powerful in the absence of a true accounting? Over 7 years in the making, with a very cool animation style and over 120 interviews, including members of the Kennedy family, the King family, and the family of Malcolm X. They also interviewed a whole lot of other people, including Mort Saul and Dick Gregory in their last interviews, aides to RFK, Adam Walensky, and Peter Edelman, Andrew Young, Jesse Jackson, Oliver Stone, the Reverend James Lawson, Robert Dallek, James Douglas, David Talbot, House Select Committee Chair Robert Blakey, and dozens more. So again, Four Died Trying will be available starting November 22nd on Apple TV, Google Play, Amazon, Journeyman, and the fourdiedtrying.com website. You can also follow Four Died Trying on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Hey, everybody. It's time for Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good, 1/3 of Devil's Chess Club. I'm also the author of American Exception, Empire, and the Deep State, and the host of the American Exception podcast on Patreon. Today, later in the show, Bryce and I are rejoined by our co-host and Devil's Chess guru, David Talbot. He is, of course, the author of several books, including The Devil's Chessboard. We will all be discussing Robert Kennedy Jr.'s recent confirmation on social media that on Monday, October 9th, in Philadelphia, Kennedy would essentially be announcing and kicking off an independent run for the White House. We're going to hash out some of the implications of all this. David will also discuss his new op-ed for the New York Times on the death of California Senator and the former mayor of San Francisco, Dianne Feinstein, a figure that David wrote about in his excellent book about San Francisco, Season of the Witch, Enchantment, Terror, and Deliverance in the City of Love. But first, co-host Bryce Green and I are going to talk about our own recent articles, his article on the Ukraine counteroffensive and the U.S. corporate media propaganda offensive that accompanied it. Bryce Green is, of course, our man in Bloomington, a graduate student and frequent contributor at FAIR, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. We're also going to discuss my article on the recent Kennedy assassination scare in Los Angeles and how the media has worked hard to make sure that the American public does not understand how the clandestine state has long used lone nut characters as patsies or decoys in assassination plots. So many things are happening in the world on the metaphorical devil's chessboard, and so we are just very excited to be able to talk about these issues on Devil's Chess Club. Thank you for joining us. Devil's Chess Club is an American Exception production. Please support American Exception on Patreon if you can. Now on with the show. Bryce, great. It's great to have you back.
Hey, it's great to be on, Aaron.
Now we are missing David Talbot, or Hollywood Dave, as we sometimes like to call him. He was asked to write an op-ed, I believe, by the New York Times on the occasion of Dianne Feinstein's passing. I told him, I warned him not to be too nice to Dianne Feinstein, but I trust he's going to write something great. He wrote about her in his book on San Francisco. What is? Why am I blanking on the name? It's the Donovan song.
It's not,
Season of the
it's not
Witch.
Season of the Witch. Yeah, I was about to say. Yeah, I could see David being too nice to Dianne Feinstein. I mean, like she did a lot of things that a lot of progressive-minded people would be like, oh yeah, she helped push the torture report along. It's like, yeah, well, she also helped ensure that it remained buried. So I mean, it's a mixed bag. But what's really unforgivable is just her staying in staying in Congress while they were weakened at Bernie's ing her around.
Yeah, I mean, now that she actually expired, you're kind of like, it makes their explanations as to why it was acceptable seem dubious. They're like, no, she's
I
totally
was it
fine. She's totally
didn't
fine.
her
Stop being an ageist. And then, oh, she died coincidentally.
yeah, like didn't her daughter already have power of attorney over like important legal matters?
I
Important
think
legal matters,
so.
of course, does not include Congress,
I think
of
so
course, or the
now.
Senate.
Right. Now, where David, I think, will write something interesting, and where I learned something about Dianne Feinstein through David, so I will give him credit, and I'll give her a little tiny bit of micro credit, like the Grameen Bank or something, right? Um, I learned about her role in the aftermath of the Harvey Milk assassination, and the that whole terrible debacle in San Francisco. So she was. Uh,
Harvey Milk was the gay rights activist.
Yes, yes, and he was a
That's
city
all I know him
councilman
for,
at
so
the
I don't
time,
really
and
know that history.
yeah, oh, I didn't really either. I think his David's book is great on San Francisco. It's entertaining just as any if you like any sort of book about cities and U.S. history, but it's informative as well about a whole era of history I didn't really know about. So that's cool that he's doing that, and but he's not. As a result, we are here. He should join us for the second half. So this will be good. But we have a lot to talk about anyway because you and I stay pretty busy. So I'm gonna pull this up here. Bryce, what have you been up to in Bloomington?
So that's a me. Well, we're recording this on Friday, and yesterday was the kickoff of the Indiana Graduate Workers Coalition, their new push to form a union for grad students there. Indiana University made news a couple years ago in spring of 2022 for going on strike. Actually going on strike. They got hundreds of graduate workers to go on strike for 4 weeks, and as a result of that strike, the administration basically uh, gave us a lot of our demands. They raised the salaries. Some schools were actually making things like $900 a month, which is insane. But they raised the salaries to the point where everyone got at least like $20,000 a year, and they eliminated fees for students. Uh, but don't let anyone ever tell you that organizing doesn't work. Don't let anyone tell you to remain on your ass because winning things is hard. We cover and we deal with a lot of depressing material here, a lot of material that we can't directly affect from sitting in our chairs talking about them. So it's important to remember that yes, there is a real world out there. And even though it might seem extremely dark and bleak and useless and hopeless, you can win. And they did win. And so this year we're going back to the table. They gave us a lot of our demands, but they didn't give us an actual union, which means that we got work to do. So we're actually right now our plan is to get the supermajority of graduate students signed up on union cards to say that we want a union, and then we'll take it to the admin and say we demand an election, and we also want our salaries to be pegged to the cost of living in Bloomington, and to be completely unimpeachable, we use the MIT city whatever calculator for the cost of living in our city. And we're like, well, 12-month contracts get the cost of living, 10-month contracts you get 10/12 of that. That seems pretty fair to me. What do you think, Aaron? Or are we like too privileged grad students and we shouldn't like we're not actually part of the working class, and we're really students, not workers.
The graduate students get paid worse than menial labor by and large in the United States. It's really crazy. They are very much exploited, and the university outsources teaching to them, and it's kind of disgraceful what the way that higher education has been changed. So I give you props for doing this. Um, I,
Hell
I
yeah.
I signed up to my union at Temple, even though I didn't really. I had to pay dues, but I the medical insurance they give you and other things. But I was like, well, I should just do this on principle, even if I don't quite. I don't need much of what they have, but I mean, you have to do this. You have to do what you can to support whatever to support unions and so on. If there's only a tradition of democracies and of a little bit of democracy, and there's a little bit of the union thing, and that seems to be the main way to push back against the system we live under. It feels insufficient, but there are ways that you can achieve victories, and it's a militant labor movement would be a great thing.
Oh yeah, and especially at a university. I mean, like universities are kind of at the intellectual vanguard of like American opinion making. I mean, if you
Supposed to
can,
be.
supposed to be. I mean, they are to an extent, but
In a
they've been
bad way
captured, right?
mostly now.
Yeah, in a bad way. They're captured. Like, I mean, IU actually we recruit for the CIA. Funnily enough, we recruit for like DoD positions. You know, a bunch of I have friends who get like DARPA funding. I have friends who are like Homeland Security contractors. I mean, like that stuff. Stuff permeates every aspect of our society and the university level, especially. And you know that it's not part of our platform now to be like, oh well, you know, we're gonna get the military-industrial complex off our campus, but that becomes an option if we actually have a union, if we have an organized resistance to some of the worst aspects of the corporatization of universities. And
Yeah.
if we can fight against that, then you should do it. If you sitting at home are feeling particularly bummed out by the state of the world, you see, you know, President Joe Biden on screen tripping and falling and stuttering, and you're like, wow, there's nothing I can do. Well, that's not necessarily true. There is. You can try. You can fight. There's probably something going on in your neighborhood, in your city, in your town, in your state that you can contribute to. So, if there's one thing I'm shouting from the soapbox today is get off your ass and do something.
I
In
agree with that.
soapbox.
No, that's very good. That's very good that you're doing that. And man, thinking about these senile leaders, as the counterpoint to people out there on the street and organizing and so on. I just like Dianne Feinstein and Joe Biden. Does anybody think that they're really devoting a lot of energy to the business of governance? I mean, it's just the deep state on autopilot, basically, is how I think of some of these figures.
Yeah,
It's
they're just functionaries that don't really function.
yeah, that is their function is just to sit there, and they can do that until they expire, and the machinery just goes on running.
Expires the best way to put it.
I mean, this is wild. Now, elsewhere, you have been doing other work, and I saw you on talking to Katie Halper and Aaron Mate about this, and we've talked about these
Useful
issues
idiots.
before. Yeah, on Useful Idiots. Um, this is your work on the Ukraine counteroffensive, and just how bizarre the reporting is and how off base. So now, can you fill us in? Bryce, reporting from the front. How is the Ukrainian counteroffensive going? Have they declared victory yet?
Well, I'll tell you what they say that they're winning. Everyone always says that they're winning, but the reality is, funnily, we should be talking about this today because just yesterday the New York Times published a piece talking about how over the last year, or like since January, Russia has actually captured more territory than Ukraine did, including in the counteroffensive. And even so, it's all small gains what they did, what they were able to capture. But my article was published before this. It was talking about how the press coverage of the coming counteroffensive, you know, first it was called the spring counteroffensive and then the summer counteroffensive when it didn't happen during spring. But the coverage of that was pretty triumphalist. You know, they had all these generals coming to the forefront. David Petraeus saying, "Oh well, yes, Ukraine has a very good plan, and I think they're going to win." You had Lindsey Graham talking about, "Yeah, I've seen their plan, and the Russians can't really counter what the Ukrainians are cooking up." And then you have all these op-eds talking about how this will turn the tide. But in the background of all this, curiously, you have demonstrable proof that the U.S. intelligence establishment did not actually believe that the counteroffensive would achieve much of anything, let alone achieve the goals of severing the Russian land bridge to Crimea. The Washington Post back in April 10th, I believe, they published an addition to the Discord leak story that talked about how it was a document. They didn't publish the document; they reported on it. They published a document, or they reported on a document talking about how U.S. intelligence didn't believe that Ukraine had the manpower, or the equipment, or the ammunition to break through Russian lines in any significant way. And in addition to this, they talked to some, people on the Hill, and they said that yes, this is confirmed by reports that we get from the Defense Intelligence Agency. They spoke to Ukrainian officials who said that yes, it's kind of well known over here that we don't have a lot of ammunition or a lot of runway in terms of being able to sustain a massive offensive. This was reported in the Washington Post, which isn't like an obscure paper. It's a pretty big bastion of American journalism, and any national journalist covering Ukraine almost certainly saw this story. Like they read it, they said, okay, and then they continued to report about how much the Ukrainian counteroffensive is going to change the game and save the day. And that all that hype kept right up to the point where it became undeniable that after 8-9 weeks of the counteroffensive, Ukraine really wasn't going anywhere. You started seeing the reporting about how bad it is, how bad of an amputee problem is, because the battlefield there is like mine laden, and they're like ripping human bodies to shreds there. And then the U.S. is trying to send, the Ukrainian army is trying to send a bunch of more people in there to basically get slaughtered and achieve no significant gains. You started seeing reporting about this the gloomy mood in Ukraine. You started seeing reports about like the harrowing stories of the families who have lost loved ones as a result of this war, whose homes have been destroyed. All these scenes, they were there before the counteroffensive was officially declared a failure, but the U.S. press decided not to report on it because they've chosen a side. They're on Team Ukraine, and they are effectively serving as the press corps for the Ukrainian armed forces. I mean, it's a pretty clear decision they've made. But and then once the counteroffensive failed, then you started seeing reports about how, oh yes, well, U.S. officials actually didn't believe that this would amount to much. They really wanted to moderate expectations. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous.
But I don't understand what they gain from doing this. I don't. I'm so baffled by some of this because it seems, as you say, the intelligence people knew that this couldn't really succeed, and they make tiny little gains in different places. But to me, it seems that the Russian strategy is that they're not thinking that they're going to take territory, because to take territory they would have to expend more lives. It would be more destructive, and at present, their enemy is just rushing headlong to its death against defensive fortifications that are impenetrable. I mean, I've not seen such a bizarre spectacle in terms of like military futility in my lifetime. I don't think. I mean, there've been mismatches in like the U.S. and the Gulf War and stuff, but the U.S. just pretty much went in and wiped out the Iraqi military presence and methodically. In this case, it's so bizarre what they're doing. And then what do they gain by saying that, oh, it's going to be, they're going to win and it's going to be great. Like when it's obvious they're going to be exposed as liars before, and it's not like they couldn't carry this through an election. So what is even the point of lying about it?
Yeah, and that's the real question here. Like I keep pointing out that, well, clearly they don't care about the Ukrainian people because this course of action is getting them killed and it's getting their country destroyed. And you actually saw reporting from the New York Times, multiple reports about how U.S. officials were concerned that Ukrainians didn't want to die. They said that Ukrainians were too casualty averse. They said that they refused to push
who said
forward.
that? Was that Lindsey Graham that said that?
I think this was a tribute to an unnamed U.S. official speaking to the Times. I'd have to double check that.
Casualty averse. I mean, coming
that's
from
such an insane line.
Yeah,
it's really depressing because like you have U.S. officials saying, yes, no, go fight. Like you can win, even though knowing that they can't win. And then when they don't want to die, they're saying that, oh well, we're frustrated because Ukrainians don't want to die. They don't want to push forward. Like it's bizarre. But the question as to like what value they get from this, I mean, when that Washington Post report dropped about the Discord leaks, there were some people who tried to like carry water for the Ukrainian armed forces. I think it was David Ignatius who was writing in the Post. He said that well, maybe Ukrainian grit and determination will be an X factor in all of this. But then you had Politico reporting that the Biden administration was privately worried about what would happen if Ukrainian counteroffensive failed. Like, like that doesn't make sense to me because if they're worried that a failed counteroffensive will cause support for Ukraine to dry up, and they also know that the counteroffensive is going to fail, then what incentive do they have for encouraging the counteroffensive to go forward? Even if your goal is to bleed Russia, that doesn't fully explain it because Ukraine is getting bled at a faster rate. I mean, you've seen reporting recently that says that
not
Russian,
even faster at like a multiple. It's not exponential, but it's like set like 9-1 or something like that.
yeah. You've seen different numbers turn around, but no one is saying that Ukraine and Russia are like, depleting their resources at the same rate. I mean, Russian capacity to like build tanks and things like that, it's like doubled since over the last year. Whereas Ukraine never had that capacity to begin with, and they're relying on old weapons from places like Poland and the U.S. and other NATO countries. And that support is even imperiled as the various countries involved are kind of questioning the wisdom of continued support for Ukraine. I mean, you have a little spat between Poland and Ukraine, even that's resulting from probably some interpersonal and interagency drama at the top level there. But I mean,
Also,
even that's faltering.
international missiles, right?
Yeah,
Didn't Ukraine accidentally shoot a missile into Poland another one recently?
yeah. Well, there was. I think there was another one. I actually missed the story. I couldn't tell if they were talking about the one that happened before or another one that happened. In
Yeah.
either case, the Ukrainians did inadvertently fire a missile that landed in Poland and killed 4 people. They immediately blamed it on Russia, of course, and then when it became undeniable, they fessed up to it. They said it was an accident. Incidentally,
Maybe that's
talking,
what it was. Maybe there's an update to that older story. But either way, there's at some point. I mean, occasionally you'd hear little rumblings of like somebody in Poland being like, we could just sort of maybe that part used to be part of Poland. I mean, we could maybe
yeah,
ease on in there, which is
yeah,
also kind of
it's kind
darkly
of crazy.
comic.
Yeah, it's a crazy time. And what's worse, I don't know if you saw this, but yesterday it was reported that Ukraine was actually asking the U.S. to bomb Iran and Syria because they said that Iran is assisting Russia with the drone production. It seems that Iranian drones are going towards Russia. Iran continues to deny it, but I mean, it seems like they are. But in any case, bombing them is just like insane. Like what? I don't even have words for that. Like you have a grown adult person in like 2023 suggesting that the U.S. go bomb Iran as part of a plan to like save Ukraine and bomb Syria as part of a plan to save. Like what are these people smoking? I mean, it's ridiculous.
I
There's
think
only
I
one
know.
way out.
I think you're getting close to it. I think it's probably the presidential palace in Kiev is. I just imagine it's sort of like the closing scenes of Scarface, and you've got Zelensky at his presidential desk with a huge pile of cocaine, and he's snorting it. It's late at night, and he's just thinking about how he's going to turn things around. And the idea gets into his mind, like if they could bomb Iran and Syria, this would be advantageous. This is the key. And then he calls up the White House and says it, and then maybe because they're wanting to cut ties with him, they print something up about it.
Maybe, and that seems to be my working theory. I think that there is a break within the U.S. establishment between Ukraine and the U.S. You started seeing grumblings of this. I mean, General Mark Milley was saying that we should negotiate. He was talking about that back in November, back in December, and now we're starting to see some
Well, yeah,
op-eds.
he said like it was a mistake to have. Did he say that it was maybe a mistake to have broken them up, or did he say that we should start negotiating? I don't remember which one, or maybe he said both.
Oh, Millie in the winter, like in December or November, he said that this winter might now be a good chance to start negotiations. Things will be stalled for a while, and then it was later reported that the Biden administration told them to shut the fuck up because that wasn't their line at the time. But then Politico just ran a story last month or a month and a half ago, quoting U.S. officials saying that, oh, well, maybe Milley had a point with the whole idea of negotiation. Maybe there was no way out of this to begin with. Like, again, the key question here is: are these people that stupid? Are they like really drinking their own Kool-Aid? Are they believing their own propaganda that they don't see the actual reality? Or are they just like cynical manipulators lying uh, for some reason? Like it's not clear to me which one it is. Maybe some people are cynical, but even the cynics, I gotta ask, like, what are you doing? Like, this isn't. It's not as advantageous to the U.S. as some people like to make it out to be. Like, this was in NATO's strategic interest to, start this war and isolate Russia and generate pro-NATO consensus and give a lot of propaganda victories for the alliance. But it's not in NATO's interest to have Russia and China be so close together, to have the entire rest of the world basically like thumb their nose at the U.S. saying, no, uh, look, you've gone too far this time. We understand what you're doing here, and there's an alternative system rising, and we don't like you. We want that. Like, that's not in the U.S. interest. That's not in NATO's interest. But that seems to be the thing that they're pushing along. So it's a
It's
it's a weird situation.
it's staggering to me to contemplate what went into this debacle for the U.S. And it's not that the U.S. can't afford to waste money and resources on fruitless military, adventures, because in a sense the entire military industrial complex is like that. It's just funneling a bunch of money into arms production and so on, and maintaining all these bases around the world. But in this case, I think it has set off some different things. It set things in motion in a number of areas that are going to be problematic for the United States. I just saw an article, or it was a post on social media talking about the SWIFT payments system, and which is a U.S. dominated or created system, but it can function sort of neutrally in terms of like allowing different currencies to be exchanged internationally to settle payments. And the share of the euro like went down a good bit, and the share of the renminbi, Chinese currency, had gone up, and it seemed like the difference was that there was now much less of the euro being traded, and then and then more proportionally of the yuan trading. So on the surface, that wouldn't seem like the dollar is necessarily in worse shape, but the bigger dynamics of what's happening in Europe and around the world are troubling when you add it to that. I mean, look at France, and the whole European economy, the whole economy of Western Europe is struggling, I think, because of these, the cutting off Russian gas and other things like that. But you also have their invested capital in places like West Africa that seem to be imperiled now, and those countries are more likely to want to do business, Niger, Algeria. They have reasons to want to do business with China or Russia potentially, rather than allowing the French to keep screwing them over decade after decade. So what's France going to do? They're like, you don't have these resources anymore in West Africa, or you're going to have less of them, or you're going to have to buy them at like actual market value. Oh no, that's the nightmare for every white imperialist country. Uh, or you're going to have to do business with Russia and China. Like, how is the U.S. The U.S. cannot take on Western Europe as a ward, because their economy is totally wrecked by not being able to do business with Russia and having their external capital imperiled by the fact that some of the countries that they've been looting are now going to be are going to be closer to actually being sovereign. This it seems to be setting off some real shockwaves that are going to pile up, the impacts of which are going to pile up gradually, and I don't know where it's going to
For a
go.
long time. Yeah, it's weird. Like in Europe, especially, like they put this whole Nord Stream business and the cutting off of liquid natural gas. Jeffrey Brodsky. I think we were all on AE together to talk about the Nord Stream. He just published an article at Fair talking about how the coverage, calling Germany the sick man of Europe. Like that old 19th century moniker. Was
Yeah, for
talking about
like
how
Turkey and China, right? They were the sick
yeah, yeah,
men.
yeah. It's like, oh, there's always someone, the weak link on the continent, basically. And it's talking like, oh, well, German industry is really suffering as energy prices have skyrocketed. Um, but as Brodsky points out, they ignore a key factor in that, which is the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, which brought gas from Russia to Germany, and that the U.S. presided over its explosion, whether or not it was U.S. divers or Ukrainian divers. I mean, it's beside the point. You know, it should get figured out eventually, but it's beside the point. The U.S. knew about it because they had the Baltics wired up, and they knew every ship at every time, at every second of every day, where they were. And after this explosion happened, they refused to share it. And the media refuses to report about it, even when they're talking about the long term economic effects of losing something like that. Even when they talk about Germany as a sick man of Europe. And of course,
Yeah.
they're using this as a moment to say that, oh well, should Germany really have all these social protections, all these social safety nets? Maybe they should take that down a notch. All this stuff, it's ridiculous. But the idea of like taking on Western Europe as a ward, I think, like you say, I think is pretty unfeasible. It doesn't make sense given, I mean, given anything, trying to break off Europe from Asia is silly because, you know, they're on the same continent. They're on
I
the
mean,
same
yeah, it's a
continent.
totally made up thing. Europe is a
Yeah.
totally made up thing.
And then the idea that it's actually better if we use like expensive ships to ship stuff instead of pipelines, instead of railroads. No, we need like giant cargo ships. That'll make everything better. It's so stupid, but that's the vision. That's the, you know, that's the current version of what was thought up at that, you know, War and Peace Studies thing at the in the middle of World War II. Like this is the same vision carried forward to now, and unlike then, where it was semi-workable, considering that the you know, the imbalance of power between the U.S. and the rest of the world, we don't have that imbalance of power now. And you know, if the elites don't realize that, we're going to be in trouble.
Yeah. I mean, it's just these issues are the same issues that have been facing Western policymakers for decades and decades and decades, you know, for the 19th and 20th and 21st centuries. These issues of like dividing up the world and trying to dominate it. And you look at Malcolm X and how he, after he broke with the Nation of Islam, he became more of an internationalist and wanted to take the same case that Paul Robeson wanted to take to the United Nations for human rights violations. And the rest of the world is yearning to escape the Western domination, and I think that we're going to find. I think a lot of places are sort of playing nice with the U.S., but there are elements in them that probably recognize how they are not really sovereign, and that once the fortunes really change for the U.S., it's gonna. I believe that you may see people break ranks. You know, Scandinavia seems like a natural to sort of break ranks with the U.S. for geopolitical and philosophical reasons, even. But once the economic and material security isn't there, what does the U.S. really have? It's uh, and they're gonna find themselves more isolated if they don't change direction soon, which I have to think at some point it's going to dawn on people in the establishment, and they're going to realize their options are kind of limited, and they really, it's not even a situation where if things are going to stay the same, they're going to have to really change. It's like you can't even really change things in a despotic or violent way to maintain the relative dominance that the U.S. has vis-a-vis the rest of the world. It just I don't see how
It
it's even
won't work.
possible.
It doesn't. Like there is no, like we don't have the tool set. We don't have the tool set ideologically or industrially to handle the changes, unless, you know, unless something changes like in the next, I don't know, decade or so. Something really changes the direction, the trajectory of the U.S. in the next decade, which, you know, I'm not really too optimistic about. It's gonna put into effect changes that might be you know, unavoidable. We were talking to Galbraith about this. I don't know if we got this in the recording, but we were talking about like what's the long term effects of like this whole anti dollar regime when the U.S. loses its exorbitant privilege around the world. Well, what happens to the U.S.? Like our entire standard of living is based off of that sort of privilege. And if we have such a high like cost of living here, high rent overhead, it's you can't really sustain that without the exorbitant privilege that we have. So our entire industrial system, our entire way of life is going to need to change in some way.
It's not even an industry. I mean, there is industry to an extent, but it's the way that they have outsourced everything because they just figured all of this money and capital, we'll just move it around and we can just make more of it. If there's any problem, we just turn on the
Yeah,
Rumpelstiltskin machine, and that situation is gonna be different. I think before too long. I was surprised that even though Professor Galbraith had a very broad critique of the fundamentals of U.S. economic dominance and so on, he was more sanguine about the dollar. I was a little surprised in a sense. Not that although I say personally, I have no idea exactly how it's going to play out. And I think if the U.S. is not insane, well, if the U.S. is not any more insane than it has been, there's a way that they could negotiate some things with other countries in the world to like keep the U.S. as a viable international currency, and then it would it would give the U.S. breathing room to reform things more, its society more over time. I hope that somehow there's some common sense prevails.
yeah. We'll see. We'll see. I mean, first we got to make sure we don't blow up the world first.
That's it. That's
First we
it.
got to make sure we don't blow it up, and then we can deal with the complicated stuff. But
That's right. Now the last thing gets into some sort of rather horrifying doomsday kind of subject matter, and that's my latest piece for Kennedy Beacon, and this one is on the recent assassination scare in L.A., where a strange man who had phony credentials and was carrying weapons approached a Kennedy campaign event, and Gavin DeBecker's security people, because Kennedy has to have private security for some reason. Joe Biden refuses to give him Secret Service protection. They intercepted this fellow and held him until police could come and get him. But this is a very disturbing thing. We talked about this a little bit, and I on a previous episode, and I wanted to write an article to highlight the parallels between this event and other things in the assassinations of the Kennedy brothers. I mean, the lone nut aspect is obvious. There's a connection to or parallels between a Chicago plot, where there was a fake plot before the president was actually killed. And I mean, and it had a patsy and everything, and it was very similar to what happened in.
well, it wasn't quite fake, was it? I thought it was just sort of foiled.
Yes, thank you. It was the status of what was being attempted in Chicago is kind of disputed or unknown because we're not privy to what they were doing. Some people have speculated that it was a test run in a sense to see how certain things perform. Others would say that it was actually a plan to assassinate the president. I tend to think that it was an assassination plot and then it just got bungled in some way. But either way, it was very similar. You had snipers with who were also, I think, Latino or Cuban.
I believe that they were described as Cuban.
Right, but then they don't take any names from anyone, so then nobody knows.
And the patsy is a similar background as Oswald. He was part of the U-2 program at a Japanese air base, who was then later secreted away. I don't think he was a false defector. Was Thomas Arthur Valier defector?
No, he wasn't a false defector, but was involved in training Cuban expats. Right before he moved to Chicago, he had been in Long Island. He told Edwin Black that he'd been working for the CIA, training Cuban exiles, and then he just moves to Chicago and finds work right over finds work in a location that's right over a very slow curve in a president's motorcade route.
Yeah.
And they detain him. They have him tailed, but they'd only detain him. I didn't put all of the details about him in the story because, I didn't want to go so far. I didn't want it to be 3,000 words.
It's a deep story. It's just deep lore on the Kennedy assassination.
Right, but when they are following this guy, his name's Thomas Arthur Valet or Valley. I don't know how you say it. Usually, you hear people say Valet. I think um, they're tailing this person who seems to be like a patsy, and they finally arrest him a little bit before the president's plane was to have touched down. But the president had canceled his trip. It seems that he was only arrested after that information would have been uh, known to the police. If like officials would have known that Kennedy was not coming before he canceled his trip. So if you go back and you actually look at the time, they had arrested him at a point where they would have known about it being canceled. So it's the guys that were following him. One of them was later involved in that notorious Fred Hampton case, the cops that were
Mm-hmm.
tailing this patsy. So it may have been that they were tailing this person so that if they did kill the president, they could arrest him, and then they could have just, explained that he was arrested at this place, or they could have just shot him and said it was a shootout. They could have done anything to pin it on this guy. It's a very disturbing case. So the one thing that we do know about this new shooter in LA is that the one really useful piece of information is that his brother claims that he was told by this lone nut fellow, his brother, that he said, "Hey, can you just drive me out here? I have a one-day security gig at this location." And so he goes out there and he says he has some message for President Kennedy or something. He's supposed to talk to President Kennedy. So this guy may have just thought he was working a job and was there to be to send some sort of message or to be a distraction or just to test the actual security response. We don't really know. But if you're familiar with the way these things work, a lone nut like this who is being directed by someone that we don't know, this is just it's very scary if you're
So
familiar with the history.
did he say that he was sent, or is that just what he said, that, oh, I thought, or I'm here on a security gig?
That's
Uh
what his brother explained to Daily Beast reporters, or the reporter who wrote the story. Apparently, his brother explained that he told me that he was working a one-day security gig, and then he doesn't really give me details about these things.
so has he been quoted in the news at all? The guy that they arrested for this, has he been giving comments or whatever? Or
I don't believe so, but I believe that there's another report or investigation from the Kennedy Beacon coming on this, so they may get more details about the guy.
huh? Yeah, this is an interesting case because, when I first saw it, I was like, I shrugged because, like, weird stuff happens all the time, and I can't always let my paranoia antenna guide how I spend my time. But then I saw that article in the Daily Beast where they called him. What I say? We were talking about it with David last week. They called him like an ideological counterpart or something to RFK.
They call him an anti-vaxxer just in the headline. They say anti-vaxxer shows up at RFK rally or something to that effect. I mean, it's a really devious and awful headline.
Yeah, they say like he likes conspiracy theories, so RFK likes conspiracy theories. So maybe he was just trying to meet his friend there or something like that. It was like ridiculous.
Yeah, when Malcolm X was killed in 1960, February of 64, no, February 65, um, he wait, what year was he killed? 64 or 60? I think it was 64, I think. Wasn't it? Or was it? No, it must have been 65 because you have Kennedy assassination, chickens coming home to roost. It must have been February
Yeah, it was
65.
65.
Okay. So, but when he was killed, when Malcolm X was killed, the New York Times, it was the New York Times or Life magazine, they had a story that said, yesterday someone came out of that darkness that Malcolm X spawned and killed him.
Yeah.
And I felt like this is the same kind of bullshit. Really, it's they're trying to suggest that Kennedy, because he is criticizing vaccine regulations and so on, that he is creating a political environment from which an assassin may emerge to come and kill him. That to me seems the subtext here. That
Yeah,
they don't say it that way, but like to me, that's what comes through, and it reminds me of like that thing on Malcolm X.
Yeah, they said that the Trump loving internet conspiracy theorist is in custody, after approaching a rally for his, quote, apparent spiritual compatriot, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., while armed. Like, well, why would you write that? Like, what apparent spiritual compatriot? Just because, they get labeled with this thing called conspiracy theorist. And that's just like a blanket statement. So, oh, they must be friends. They must be in total agreement. But it's so weird, like that they would write that. It's par for the course though, because we've talked about like my feelings about RFK Jr. But what's clear, what's obvious, is that the mainstream media wants everyone to hate him, and they want him to be outside of the bounds of acceptable public discourse. When say what you let's say that everything that RFK Jr. has said about like vaccines is misguided and incorrect. Well, okay, that has had less of effect on the world than the open lies that Joe Biden's told about Iraq, and he's still part of respectable society. It's had less effect than Judy Miller publishing nonsense at the New York Times that got us into war. Like the things that they choose to make outside the bounds of acceptable discussion doesn't have anything to do with actually the effects on human beings or the effects on institutions. It has everything to do with what the elite class of people think is acceptable. The quote right thinking people. It's like I keep saying this, but like it's what Lance said when they say conspiracy theory. They don't mean that what they're saying has been fact checked and verified or not verified, and they can refute every point. What it means is that they've said something that goes against conventional ideas about how institutions operate, the integrity of the people that operate them, and assumptions about how the world can work. Like if you go against that, well, then conspiracy theorist. And so everyone is in that box. And even if it looks like one of them's trying to kill you, it's your fault because you're in that box.
Yes, that Lance did emphasize that aspect, that the term is really instrumentalized to anathematize and a priori discredit narratives or musings or suspicions which call into question the legitimacy and lawfulness of the regime. If it's especially that if you're suggesting that we are governed in a covertly despotic or fascist way, if that's what your reporting or your analysis is pointing to, then you'll be a conspiracy theorist. But the volume of evidence that we are governed in that way is just enormous, and that's this contradiction that just sits out there in the public record. And these assassinations are, all four of those people in the 60s were trying to do about the same thing from different positions. By the time that they're at the end of their lives, they are all doing the same thing, and they all die similarly. And we have this, it's out there. The Four Died Trying is going to look at this and hopefully open people's eyes up to this reality. But it points to a totally different system that we live under than what we assume that we live under, what we're taught that we live under. And I guess my beef or my disagreement with much of the establishment left is that they are really in denial about this. They cannot solve the political assassinations of the 1960s, which really aren't that mysterious. But they can't solve them because they don't want to solve them, I think. I think they don't want to accept things that would make them anathema at the whatever sinecures they have in this regime, or whatever sort of media they have. One foot in the mainstream or halfway respectable media, they want to keep that there. And this I think is the way that the left gets managed, is that the people who are professional leftists who set opinions in some ways, people who have or work in universities or write for media outlets that have any kind of budget, they almost always have to toe the line on this. It's very rare that you see any dissent on these issues, and I don't think that's an accident in a sense. I think that's the way that the left has been kind of managed and co-opted, is by controlling the spectrum of allowable opinion within institutions that can actually employ people to speak about these issues. So
Yeah.
we're really like kept stupid on purpose about these things.
And like some of these people, I sympathize with them, right? Because your whole life you're raised in this ideological system where even if you do happen to solve the assassination of the 60s, I mean, like you said, it's pretty easy to do if you want to think, if you give it like any bit of thought.
It's about
But
on the
even
level
then,
of Blue's Clues, really, when it comes down to it.
yeah, actually, like the only thing keeping you from, like it keeps saying, if this happened in another country, it'd be like, oh, well, they clearly did it. Like I think about the level of evidence for things like the Skripal poisoning, or even Navalny getting sick on that plane. Like the level of evidence that people have to implicate the Kremlin is so
Putin
low.
specifically,
Putin
personally.
specifically, yeah, yeah, the man himself. The evidence that's required to blame that on Vladimir Putin is so low, so minuscule. But when we have every sign pointing to a conspiracy, and in all these cases, the four assassination of the '60s, it's like, oh my god, you got to write 6 books, and even then, we're not going to listen to you. Like with the Skripal, it's like, oh well, CNN said that they called up a guy in the Kremlin's assassination department, and he spilled the beans, and we recorded the phone call, and we actually had Navalny talk to him. I was just watching that a few weeks ago, and I was
Yeah,
like,
wasn't that was a thing, right? I mean,
yeah, like that's what they did, and they're like, well, that solves it. We called the guy who we say that is part of this super secret team, and a voice on the phone said that yes, we did it. So it's solved, guys. And with the Skripal poisoning, I mean, you don't even have that. I mean, this is a whole other episode. Which I mean, it would be interesting to talk about to that with something like with someone like I don't know, someone who's done some
Craig
good work on
Murray. I
it.
think Craig Murray has looked at it
Craig
more
Murray
than
did that
anyone.
great like 10 points that I don't agree with about the official version.
And they're all,
Um,
each one of them. I recall. I couldn't recite them now, but I recall at the time reading them and thinking in each one like, what,
yeah,
that's
it's
wild.
so
Well,
bizarre.
how can this story just sit out there?
Yeah, if our listeners don't know what we're talking about, I think it was in 2018, in the city of Skripal in England in the UK.
No, it's not the
A
city. I think the city is like maybe Lancashire or something. But the Screeples are the name of the
Oh,
people.
the Skripal's the name. Yeah, my bad. See, I'm
It
getting
might not
old.
be Lancashire, but I think it's some city that's near. My English geography is bad. It's some city
Yeah,
that's near Stonehenge, I believe, and that was the part of this. But anyway, set that
yeah,
aside. Continue. Sorry to interrupt, but that's
yeah. Well, the
the
Skripal's.
Screeples are the people.
Yeah, it was a guy, a defector, a Russian defector, and his daughter, I believe
Yeah.
it was. Yeah, basically they were found like on a park bench, and with alleged signs of poisoning. And the UK official story is that they were poisoned by Novichok, which is something that only the Russians have. And Putin's so stupid that he used something that only the Russians would have to kill this defector guy. Uh,
But yeah,
that's the
who
official
found
story.
them? Who found them on the
Who
bench?
found them first? Well, that's one of the points is that the first person, the absolute first person to see these people, was the top like chemical specialist for the UK's military.
Dang,
Like
that's
not
the
like
UK. The UK, see, they're looking out for you. They're so vigilant. Like they'll send you get poisoned by an international terrorist. Bam, the top person handling covert operations and bioterror is right there on the scene. That's
that's the power of
awesome.
the
I love
NHS,
democracy.
the NHS. It's a sight to behold. Plus, Aaron, I mean, you got to cut them some slack. The island's so small. The chances of running into any one person are vastly higher than here in the U.S.
They all
But
know
that's the
each
story
other.
that they told. That's the story that they told. And if you go and read Craig Murray's, I mean, we're getting way off topic here. But if you go and read Craig Murray's article about it, you can see just like how flimsy the story is. There's other critical work on that.
But
I don't.
the other issue is that the guy. I think this is relevant. I mean, we've talked about the Kennedy assassination scare a bit before and today, so I'm happy to just say a couple things about the Skripal thing, because it just shows their ability. Like, it doesn't matter if a story is absurd. Like, if the emperor says it's true, that it's just gonna be true. And
Mm,
the Skripal case, the guy was this sort of, I don't want to say soft defector, but I don't know. He was like a kind of ambivalent, waffling defector, because I think he was trying to actually get back to Russia at the time. But
yeah,
that's where
I
you're
think
like,
that's what was
okay,
confirmed later.
so they wouldn't wait for him to come back and hit and then whack him with the Novichok, which is, oh, they're just waiting for it right there to stick him with it, right? Like, once he gets out, they can't. They're just so excited to kill this guy that they just send these two bumbling doofuses. I don't know what those guys were. I mean, their story
Yeah,
is
I don't know
weird,
what
but
those other
like,
guys were actually doing there. They said that they found two Russian guys who were being suspicious and like hanging around in the vicinity of where these Skripals were, and then they found I think like some Novichok sample like in a trash can miles away 10 days later or something. You go look at the article because I don't want to bungle the facts here. But I mean, you tell me whether or not that you think the official story is credible. I'm like, I don't necessarily have an alternate version of exactly what happened. But I mean, you don't need one when you know the state's lying to you in obvious ways. I
well,
mean, it's the same
they
thing
don't
with
let
the
the guy talk to anyone. The daughter tried to call someone, and she made some really interesting statements about the way they were being held, and it seems that they're actually being jailed. Like,
yeah, like
I mean, I think
incommunicado.
they would probably say, "Oh, they're in witness protection," but man, what does that even? If you believe that, then I mean, you're very credulous. I think.
Yeah, like you have a lot more faith in the authorities and a lot more I don't know, dismissive attitude towards coincidences than I do. Which, maybe that makes you function a little bit better. So you're not questioning all the nonsense that comes at you. But I mean, even with things like the OPCW scandal, I mean, like that's a whole other episode that we could talk about for like 16 hours.
Yeah, we
But
should
like
do that at some point. Maybe we can get Aaron Monte to come on here or something.
yeah, because like that's one of the like in terms of big lies of the 21st century, like that's a pretty important one. Like I actually had a friend recently come up to me and talk to me like, well, yeah, do you support Assad like like Tulsi Gabbard does? And I was like, look, I don't think the U.S. should be trying to overthrow the Syrian government. And they were like, well, like he gassed his own people, like, and he's a dictator. And I was like, well, I mean, dictator is a term that we throw around a lot, both for people U.S. supports and the U.S. is against, but there is no credible evidence of that chemical attack. And I talked about the OPCW leaks, and they hadn't heard of them, of course, because they weren't reported on anywhere other than like I think it's only been Aaron Monte in like the media who's talked about this.
He's
But
done
I mean,
more
the
in the
documents are in WikiLeaks.
semi-mainstream. Yeah.
Yeah, and the European, there's some European body. You know how they have all these European commissions or whatever. But one of them just came out with the report talking about uh, examining this episode of these chemical weapons being used. But even if you don't have any evidence, the official story is that the Syrian government was beating back the rebels, and the Obama government issued a warning that said, if you use chemical weapons, we're gonna get NATO involved. We're gonna get the U.S.
It's a red
involved.
line.
It's a red line. And then the official story is that Assad hears that and then decides to go apeshit with the chemical weapons.
Yeah.
That to me, like, it doesn't make sense.
No.
Like, it could have happened. Like, I'm not saying it absolutely didn't happen, but I mean, you gotta take some large leaps in logic to accept that storyline, at least without questioning it.
Yeah, this is
And when you
true.
consider that all these different chemical weapons attacks, they were reported on and then they fell from the media. They were reported on, fell from the media. One of them, it was like, oh well, this isn't a slam dunk, according to the Obama administration. Another one, you had the actual OPCW investigators on the ground say, "No, we don't think this is what happened. We don't think this was the Assad government." You can have all that. It's in the public domain. We have the damn internet, and yet people still are so kept in the dark. They're still so ideologically opposed to hearing a different side of these things because, like I said, these are some of the major big lies of the 21st century, and they're central to how we understand uh, the American geopolitics or America's justification for their geopolitical project. It's
Yeah.
like Iraq had WMDs. The Taliban don't want to give up Bin Laden. Gaddafi is, killing his people. Assad used chemical weapons, and the Ukraine invasion was unprovoked. I mean, they keep coming. They keep
Yeah.
coming, and
No,
stay vigilant.
this is the era. I mean, the big lie is it's not just that it's a part of our system now. Here in the last 20 years, really beginning with 9/11, you could say the big lie becomes a major facet of political life. It's big lie after big lie. Epstein, the Skripals, the OPCW scandal, the Ukraine war, Iraq war, Iraq WMD, the so many issues. 9/11, the anthrax attacks, it's Russiagate. I mean, there's just so many.
Rushing it. Oh my god. Yeah, like it
Libya,
keeps
the Libya
coming.
scandal. I mean, this is, I think, something that people are going to look at decades from now. If we can reform this system, they will look back at this time as the era of the late imperial era of the big lie, or of big lies, because it becomes just a facet of our of everyday life, is just these absurd lies that get thrown out there. But with that said, we're gonna wrap up this segment, and then we're gonna bring on our man out there, David Talbot, and we're gonna have him talk about his article on San Francisco that he wrote earlier, and then also about Dianne Feinstein and his tribute, obituary, report, op-ed. What we'll ask him how he wants to describe this piece. So. David Talbot, it's great to have you here with this exciting news we've got to talk about.
Yeah, I'm excited.
I've been very happy to thinking about the implications of all this. And his independent run, it seems he's all but announced it. He's announced that he's going to announce it, which is kind of like announcing it. And this is going to take place in Philadelphia near me, so I hope to be there if I'm at all able to. How do you think that this changes things? I mean, you're more loyal to the Democrats, and he was also more loyal to the Democrats, obviously, than me at this point. So I was cheering for this. I was advocating this from the beginning. What do you think is what's the significance of this?
Yeah, well, I agree with you. I think in some ways it's a huge upheaval, given the Kennedy connection to the Democratic Party. Obviously his father and his uncle and his two uncles both lived and died as Democrats. The whole party is wedded. The whole family is wedded to the Democratic Party. So it was a huge decision for Bobby to make at this point. And for me as well, to support it, as I did in a column a couple of weeks ago. I said the DNC has so rigged the primary system. He's been double Bernied, really checkmated every twist and turn, starting with New Hampshire, which is traditionally the first primary. And now, because South Carolina voted last time for Biden, they rewarded South Carolina and punished those who voted in New Hampshire, the DNC. So, obviously, it's a very corrupt organization out to undermine Bobby, anyone who challenges Biden for the presidency. And by the way, Biden is toast. I mean, Jim Carville, of all people, who's the voice of the Democratic Party, James Carville, who was an advisor to President Clinton for years, he came out the other day and said that Trump would easily beat him this year if the election held in November would beat Biden. He thinks the Democratic Party should be smart enough to replace Biden as soon as possible with someone else, which is what I've been saying for some time. So maybe the Democratic Party will wake up and replace Biden with someone more viable, but it's not going to be Bobby Kennedy. Obviously, he's out of the mainstream politically. That's why we support him. And it was a big decision for him. I know, Bobby, I know how big a decision it was for him to leave the party of his family. But I think he had no choice.
I agree. The Democrats weren't going to do anything. I had the sense that they were going to try to not even that they weren't going to even admit that Biden was stepping down until it was too late to really have much of a primary. That maybe that's how they were going to do it. And even if they did have a primary, they would just do what they did to Bernie. They would have a bunch of dummy candidates enter that would just be that they could just have enter and drop in at their own whim, and they could fund them with enormous amounts of money. Nobody gave millions of dollars to beat Buttigieg.
And of course, they get rewarded with media exposure and positions and good graces in the party, of course.
Yeah, I mean, what they did with that was so absurd. The funneling all that money to Liz Warren and Pete Buttigieg, when I don't think that those funders had any inclination or sense that these people were going to win at all. It was just like, how do we rig this to get Bernie out? And then that's how it played out. So he made the right move, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think the system is corrupt, and Bobby recognized that and thought his only path to the White House is as independent. And no independent has won, in my memory, the White House. So it would be historic first. Every candidate, I think, who's ever run for president has had a major political party behind them. And no one has won, I think, in at least 100 years, more than 100 years, who has not been in Republican or Democratic Party. So it's a huge gamble for him politically to run as an independent. But I think the system, as you've said, Aaron, is coming apart so quickly now. Who knows what could happen next year? I think things are really chaotic. I mean, when a Donald Trump can get elected president, selected president, because he did so with the Electoral College, not the popular vote, as we know, then anything is possible. So I think it'll be a three-way race next year. I don't think Democrats are stupid enough to go with Biden. I think, as they said, he's done. His poll numbers are in free fall. He's old, he's doddering. He had to read a statement yesterday about Senator Feinstein, who he's known for at least 40 years. They can't have him go out in public without being embarrassed by him now. So, he's done his duty. He served the party loyally all his life, and now he should step down. I think he'll be replaced by someone like Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, who I also know. I think it'll be a three-way race next year between Trump as a Republican, and Gavin Newsom will be the Democratic nominee, and Bobby Kennedy.
Yeah, and I'm not as in tune with some of the legal arguments behind this, but I have read that some Republicans, in different states, are advocating that Trump be removed from the ballot on the grounds that he violated the, I believe, 14th Amendment, some statute there. But I mean, if that does happen, like let's say Biden is toast, let's say Trump is toast. Well, what does that leave? I mean, DeSantis and Christie and Ramaswamy and the rest of that Republican clown show gang aren't really that popular with Republican voters relative to Trump. And then you have on the Democratic side, you have Marianne Williamson, who was in the primary. If they replace with Gavin Newsom, I mean, I don't know what Gavin Newsom's numbers are like across the country, but I mean, he hasn't really been in the news much, and he can't be that popular to the point where he could reliably and credibly take all of Biden's voters. So then you do have a weird situation where independents might be, and also the general American public, most of them identify as independents rather than with either the two party structures. And so you do have what seems to be some sort of opportunity, be it Cornel West or RFK Jr., who is able to seize on that momentum. I mean, it's the first time. I mean, I'm younger, so I could say in my lifetime, but it's the first time in a time when I've read about in American history where something like that is actually, credible. It might have a chance of success.
I agree. I think, we talked last time about the dream ticket being Bobby and Cornel. And I think there's been a lot of pushback against that idea from the pro-Israel crowd, the lobby, because of Cornell's position on Israel and Palestine, which I think is the correct one. He cares about Palestinians as human beings. And I think that's the correct position to take. And because of that, he was denied tenure, I believe, at Harvard. So I think Bobby, unfortunately, has been surrounded by advisors who are pushing a very strong line in Israel. I'm all for Israel as a democracy, but I'm not for the Netanyahu government. I'm not for the anti-Palestinian policy that his government advocates, and people to his right, even who he's made coalition with to save his own neck. This is Netanyahu. So I believe that the forces of democracy should be allied with in Israel. I don't believe that the Netanyahu regime is a proper partner for us going forward. And so I hope Bobby and Cornell are able to work out their political differences on Israel. But I agree with you and Aaron on this. I think they have more in common with each other than they have pulling them apart in terms of their critique of the corporate control of Washington, in terms of their critique of the American empire, in terms of much of what they say about the environment and labor. Cornel West and Bobby Kennedy are on the same page. So I hope they're able to go forward together next year as a ticket.
You mentioned that it was might be difficult for the pro-Israel sentiment, the people surrounding Bobby, for an alliance like that to come about. But I mean, what is your sense generally? I mean, you're in this world a lot more than either of us are. What is your sense generally about the pro-Israel forces that are behind Bobby? Like, do you think that they have uh, a significant amount of control? Like, does that sort of political constituency exert an amount of control that could, if they wanted to, derail an alliance between West and RFK? Or is that just a tendency within his brain trust?
That's a very good question, Bryce. And I'm not a member of Bobby's inner circle. I can't be because I write for it, Kennedy Beacon, which is a nonprofit separate from the campaign. And legally, I'm not allowed to advise the campaign or be close to him. But Bobby is my friend. I see things like you do from afar. And some of what he said in Israel concerns me. I'm still obviously a big supporter of his. And I don't agree with 100% ever with a candidate for office. And the same with Bobby. I think anyone who actually visits the West Bank in Israel sees how Palestinians are treated and has a heart. Can't but help, understand that it's inhumane, the treatment that they've been subjected to, the Palestinian people. I think Bobby Kennedy realizes that too. So I'm hoping that whatever differences those two men have, Cornel West and Bobby Kennedy, can be sorted out in the conversation between the two of them. I don't think they're far apart on this. I don't know who's backing Bobby. Everybody who runs for president, a pro-Israeli lobby converges on them very quickly. A lot of money, a lot of influence comes from Israel. We all know that. Every candidate, I think, who's run in recent history for the presidency, every serious candidate has quickly gotten money, gotten influence also from the Israeli lobby, as we know. So it's a big factor in American politics and one that we should be concerned about, as any lobby from that represents a foreign government, I think, is a legitimate concern of ours. So, I'm hoping for the best.
Yeah, I would hope that it may be a position that he would revise down the road. I mean, the whole purpose of creating a lobby for any special interest is that you create incentives for supporting your special interests that are strong and disincentives that for opposing your special interests that are also very strong, such that the balance of power is in your favor, and it becomes an orthodoxy if you're really super successful, where the reasons for the consequences for opposing a policy are so much worse than anything you get from it. So in a sad sort of realism, I think Bobby's position is not nonsensical. one way or the other. How much time he spent on the issue, who knows? He does tend to have an open mind, and he and his own father and his own father in the past, when he was campaigning, he responded to poverty and these other issues with real moral outrage, and wanted to respond to it. So I would hope that this is an issue that he could revisit, but I also think it's but a piece of the bigger puzzle of the U.S. empire, which has heretofore been unassailable by and large. It's a bipartisan consensus, and it's the main issue in the world that the world is saddled with. The biggest problem, as much as anything, traces back to the existence of a superpower with nuclear weapons and control over much of the global economy that is totally irresponsible and lawless, and murderous oftentimes. This is the U.S. empire, and they murdered Bobby's father and his uncle. And that brings me to, which makes me think that Bobby is sincere about confronting it in a way that no other politician, even when they've made statements about U.S. foreign policy, I've taken it that seriously. So I think this is really notable. And David, you have a personal connection to Bobby's understanding of these issues. Can you tell us about when you first spoke to Bobby about what you were working on with the research that eventually became the book Brothers?
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. My relationship with Bobby Kennedy Jr. goes back about 20 years. So I interviewed him when I was running a salon. I think it was 2003. I first talked to him. I interviewed him at his office at Pace University in New York, where he was teaching environmental law. And then the next year during the Democratic convention, I met with him for breakfast during the convention in 2004, summer of that year, at the Parker House Hotel, which, as you know, played a big role in the Kennedy family political history. And we had breakfast, and I was thinking of leaving Salon at that point in 2004 to write my book, Brothers, about what his father, Robert Kennedy, thought had really happened to his brother, President Kennedy, in Dallas, and what he was quietly doing to investigate that crime, and his intention to reopen the case if he made it back to the White House in 1968. As I told Bobby this, he looked down at his plate at the Parker House the whole time. It was as if I was telling him again his father was killed. He had a stricken look on his face. He didn't want to talk about it. He looked at me and said, "My father and my family always taught us to look forward, not back. He would not investigate this crime." I said, "Bobby, with all due respect, I talked to the widow, Nancy Sheridan, who had been married to Walter Sheridan, the former FBI man, the investigator that Attorney General and Senator Robert F. Kennedy used a lot and relied on to get to look into the dark side of American power." And Sheridan, among other things, told Bobby immediately after Dallas that Jack Ruby was mobbed up, that he was playing a gangland and probably a CIA kind of mission when he killed Lee Harvey Oswald on camera that weekend, fateful weekend in Dallas. So he looked up at me at that point, Bobby Jr., and said, "You talked to Nancy Sheridan?" I said, yes. He knew how important that it was. The Sheridan name was very important to the Kennedy family because, as I said, Walter Sheridan had been one of the chief investigators that Bobby Sr. had used to look into the dark side. And as Frank Mankiewicz, Bobby's Senator Robert Kennedy's press spokesman, the man who announced his death in 1968, told me when Bobby looked at the phone records that Jack Ruby had made in the days and hours before killing Oswald, he realized they were like the witness list on the Senate Rackus Committee, which he was the chief counsel on in the 50s. These are all mob guys. That's who Jack Ruby was talking to before he hit Lee Harvey Oswald. So he didn't do it, like he said, to protect Jackie Kennedy for the Kennedy family. He did it because the mob gave him an offer he couldn't refuse. He had to do it. So Bobby realized at that point in 2004 that this was a serious investigation I was undertaking, that he would have to look backward to really come to terms with what America was all about, as I did. And as I investigated the book, I wrote the book about his father called Brothers, about the relationship, political and personal, between the two men, JFK and Bobby Kennedy, how close they were, how Bobby was traumatized by the death of his brother, how he investigated, closely held that crime afterwards, and how he intended to reopen it. I think that book and the book by James Douglas, JFK, The Unspeakable, had a big impact on Bobby Kennedy Jr. And I think my conversations in those books began to open him up. And I think he began to decide he would look at some of the darker aspects of American power because they killed his father and his uncle. And I think it was that point, I think, that Bobby really had a kind of epiphany. And he realized that he had to go places he'd never been before, just like his father had done. And I think that was the beginning for Bobby of his odyssey, an odyssey he's still on today, to speak the truth to the American people about the military-industrial complex, about the American empire, about the corporate stranglehold on Washington's regulatory agencies, about big pharma. I think he went much further than I expected. He really went all the way into understanding what America is all about.
Yeah, I was surprised pleasantly, but when he came out and endorsed on the 50th anniversary, he wrote that Rolling Stone article, which of course he would never get into Rolling Stone, the new Rolling Stone, with that Shachtman guy, that spooky fellow. But for me, that is why I was maybe surprised some people when I came out as much in support of him as I have, because I personally dealt with my own reckoning with this material after the Obama campaign, and I also read JFK and the Unspeakable, and I also read your book immediately after that, which I had ordered years ago and didn't read until I didn't get around to reading it until after that. But that book, the Douglas book, did really astound me, because it was not even that it makes you think like, oh gosh, there's a strong case here. It's suspicious. It's more that the overwhelming amount of evidence. And then your book, of course, was enjoyable to read after that, because you had all those insiders talking about it. So I had a similar experience to him reading that book, except for him, it's his own father. That for me is says that he's sincere about what he's doing, that he's not somebody who's on the make. He's just not. Like, in that, confronting the empire, which is the overriding thing above all else, this lawless, secretive regime that asserts the right to really veto a democracy, even if that means shooting an elected head of state. That is a profound thing, and that we are in denial about that is not something that can be just dismissed. It's as important as any historical issue that we could be talking about right now.
Right. Like I gotta echo that. The combination of James Douglas's book and your book. Well, I read Brothers after I read Devil's Chessboard, but all the same, I mean, it's still covering the material and learning about the insiders from that time period, who, well, Arthur Schlesinger, who said that I can't look and I won't look. Like the people who were so terrified of actually going into these things and making, that you don't want to rock the boat. You don't want to imperil your status with the elite members of society. And something like Jim Douglas's book, I mean, it's not perfect, but the case that it makes, I mean, you can't ignore it in a way that some people can. Well, one question I do have related to that is, I don't know if you saw the images of Tulsi Gabbard walking around carrying that book. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, or her in general. We don't have to talk about her, but I do understand that like that impulse. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. What book was she carrying?
JFK, The
She was
Unspeakable.
carrying, yeah, The Unspeakable.
Somebody gave it to her. I think she hadn't purchased it herself, but I
Right.
think it was somebody handed it to her, and so she had. That was why she was photographed carrying it, because somebody was like, "Here, take this."
Well,
So-
at one point, someone asked her, like, what do you think of the book? And then she gave an answer that, I mean, clearly indicated that she had no idea what was in the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I identify with the fact that that material being presented that way being a sea change. You know, maybe Tulsi will pick up the book eventually and stop being a you know,
She's got
U.S.
weird
military psyops officer. But
I mean, she takes weird anti-imperialist positions. I don't think he should pick her as his vice president. I think I would be worried.
no.
He wants to use the Richard Nixon approach, which would be Richard Nixon said he picked Spiro Agnew as his assassination insurance policy. So I think Bobby needs to think along similar lines.
I'm going to pick up on something you said, Bryce, that I think is important. I think the men, and they were largely men, around President Kennedy were, I think, formidable guys. I interviewed many of them for my books. Robert McNamara, Arthur Schlesinger, Ted Sorensen, Nick Katzenbach, Dick Goodwin, Frank Mankiewicz, and so forth. These are really smart, strong men. And they formed what I call the Band of Brothers, or what Bobby Kennedy Sr. called his Band of Brothers at the Justice Department. But they fell apart, truthfully, as you said, Bryce, after the assassination of JFK, and even more so after Bobby Kennedy was killed in '68, because they needed those two guys, JFK and Bobby, to lead them, to be strong. And without them, they didn't know what to do. They were weak, frankly. Arthur Schlesinger, when someone presented photographs of what happened at Dealey Plaza, famously, and I quoted, as you said in my book, Brothers, Bryce, I won't look, I can't look. And so he continued to play tennis with Richard Helms from the CIA, who took over the CIA and was very much likely involved in the murder of President Kennedy. He continued after that to play tennis with him. He was a friend of his, dating back to the days in the OSS together. So, you know, these guys were compromised. People like Ben Bradley, who became head of the Washington Post, was a good friend of President Kennedy. He too wimped out. I interviewed Ben Bradley in his office where he was editor emeritus of the Washington Post after he'd served there for so long. And he said, yeah, he admitted that he put his career ahead of the investigating this crime against his friend, against the president of the United States. He could have broken that. The Washington Post could have broken that story, particularly after the House Assassinations Committee unearthed so much in the late 1970s. They could have gone behind them and investigated that. And instead, the New York Times, the Washington Post, tried to shut down the House Assassinations Committee, talked about it, it was a wild goose chase. They were spending too much of the taxpayers' money and so forth. So these were missed opportunities. More so, they were strategic, I think, misses. I think men of influence, and mostly men in Washington, knew that their careers depend on them going along with the official story, whether they were in the media or in government. And the official story about Dallas was a corrupt one, was a lie that was told to the American people. And the American people, in their wisdom, realized it was a lie. And I think that has led to the erosion of trust in news institutions and the government. And they bemoan that fact today, that Trump gets a lot of mileage when he accuses them of promoting fake news. But that's what a lot of what they do is. It's fake.
And on the most important issues. It's not random what they are most wrong about.
Yep.
Yeah. It's remarkable how disciplined they all are when it comes to these issues. Because it's like you said, Ben Bradley, Washington Post editor, one of the top papers in the country, it says like, I'm not even going to bother, not even going to bother investigate what I believe might be a coup in my country. Like when you have a public that's so regimented like
And
that, like
by the way, Bryce, not only did they kill his good friend JFK, they killed his sister-in-law, Mary Meyer. She was killed mysteriously about a year later after JFK. She'd been JFK's lover. She kept a diary about that. She was killed very mysteriously on the towpath along the Potomac River, where she went for a walk each day. She was shot and killed. And later, James Angleton, Ben Bradley discovered trying to break into her art studio to steal her diary. James Angleton from the CIA. So, the whole thing smells to high heaven.
yeah, well, that's your friend. Like that's crazy. Like I can't imagine, hanging out with the murderer or a suspected murderer of my best friend. I can't imagine what career, what cocktail parties, the cheese at them things must have been so good because I don't think I could have had the stomach
Exactly.
to do that.
Yeah, that's my sense of it is the Kennedy family. I feel like personally I relate to Mort Saul. When Mort Saul, you tell an anecdote, David, in the story of Mort Saul, the comedian who basically tanked his career because he wanted to get justice in the Kennedy case, and he worked for Garrison, and he got Garrison on the Tonight Show, and that pissed off Johnny Carson and everybody. But when Mort Saul saw Jackie Kennedy somewhere in New York, I think, and he approaches her and says, "I'm out there, but killing my career to try to find out who killed your husband." And then she was just like, I know, but was like, wouldn't even sort of make eye contact with him or something. Like, I feel like it says something about Bobby that he's just not, that's not him. Because that could have been how your discussion with him over breakfast went. And you would have probably not been that surprised.
In Jackie's defense, Aaron, she said after they killed Bobby Kennedy, they're killing Kennedys in this country. And she took her kids overseas and she married Aristotle Onassis, I think, for protection. At that point, she didn't know who they would kill. So I think she wanted to raise her children with security in mind. And Dick Goodwin told me, Daniel Ellsberg told me, after they killed Bobby Kennedy, Dick Goodwin said he underwent arms training in the countryside because he was afraid they were coming after him too.
And what would he have been able to do if they were? I sympathize, but
the fact is that's the way these men were thinking afterwards, that the bad guys were coming after them.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to her, especially.
Yeah, you mentioned that Mort Saul anecdote. I mean, it just, I keep going back to the amount of public intellectuals who try to avoid talking about, a coup in Dallas, about important things. Like Noam Chomsky, one of the things he says about an example of why people shouldn't talk about the Kennedy assassination and why it's a useless issue is because he says, well, look at the example of Mort Saul. Like, he had a great career and he could have informed a lot of people about a bunch of important topics. But he decided to talk about the Kennedy assassination, and so his career tanked. So now he was unable to talk about those other issues.
Chomsky says that?
Yes.
Oh, I've never heard him say that. I've never heard him.
Yeah, I got to dig it up for you, but
that is not an argument in his favor. That is actually damning of him. We already knew that. We already knew he told Peter, when Peter wrote that classic essay on the Pentagon Papers in NSAM 273, that Chomsky's response was like, you shouldn't write this. It's bad politics. You're saying it makes a difference who's elected president. So when you're saying that, like, historical interpretations and interpretations of documentary records need to be filtered through your ideological lens, I mean, he's explicitly stating that is, well, basically, he's making an argument that implies that directly. That's wild.
I think it's important to call out our fellow journalists, public intellectuals who took a dive on this, and those who were brave and spoke out. So yes, Bryce, Mart Saul was one of the good ones. He spoke out, and Aaron, he ruined his career, like you said, because of that, because he spoke out for the truth about the Kennedy assassination. So did people like Dick Gregory, the
Yeah.
popular comedian, and so did David Crosby from the Byrds and Crosby, Stills, and Nash. These were people who risked everything to say the truth about what happened in Dallas, and they said the truth belonged to the American people and we had a right to it, which we do. People like Noam Chomsky, you're right, Bryce. Others, I think of basically, taking a dive, like I said, on this issue. And they did so sometimes for strategic reasons, and sometimes they were simply wrong, intellectually wrong. Howard Zinn, Noam Chomsky, others who took a dive on the Kennedys, didn't understand the Kennedy presidency, how historically important it was, how Kennedy broke from the military industrial complex. He was not a Cold Warrior. That's bullshit. I did the research as a historian. They should have read my book, Brothers, to see what President Kennedy did and how he threatened those people in power, how he threatened the steel industry, how he threatened the military industrial people, how he threatened the Cold War lobby in this country again and again. And that's why they killed him.
You mentioned Howard Zinn and his position on it. And he was part of the drafting of those. Was it the Gravel edition of the Pentagon Papers
Right.
release? Who said bad politics to imagine that the president has an effect. But later in his life, he did, I believe, catch hell for signing some statement calling for a new reinvestigation into 9/11 or something like that. Something that I don't think Noam Chomsky has ever done or would ever do. So
Zinn
it's interesting
said
to
he
see.
said both cases in JFK and 9/11. He said these should probably be looked into. It wasn't anything really that far out there, but he took a different stance than he or Chomsky had ever taken, and at different points towards the end of his life about JFK and 9/11, which was interesting. I think he was a well-intentioned person. The ideology is a hell of a thing.
It's a hell of a drug.
I mean, when it becomes that your entire way of looking at and interpreting the world must conform to your ideology rather than your general ideology must conform to the observable things in the world, that's, I think, a problem. But I'll say something encouraging to me, David, and I was really surprised by this. Jeffrey Sachs was just interviewed by Chris Hedges talking about JFK, and I haven't gone and listened to it, but that to me is because Hedges has never actually looked at those angles, and he's always been really anti-Kennedy, even though the rest of his analysis, when he talks about the corporate state and the lawlessness, he almost sounds like he's summarizing my dissertation sometimes, but in in a slightly different way. But the main points are there. So maybe some people, the fact he's really close to West, as I understand it, and this is to me is encouraging that people are thinking like, this is because I think it would help all the third parties. I think the Greens and the Libertarians and the People's Party, they should all rally around RFK because they're going to be harmed if he loses, because it's going to discredit third party movements. There's not going to be a good third party like this forever. And RFK needs to meet them halfway and be like, I want to make it a platform, a plank in my platform we were going to broaden the debates. We're going to make it, I support ranked choice voting, all these things that would help. I mean, something's got to be done here to bring all these forces together.
Well, I agree with you that I think it was significant that people like Chris Hedges and Robert Shear, by the way, Shear Post, who's I think a hero of mine, was at Ramparts when I was young. He's still kicking. He's a great journalist of the left. He worked for Ramparts, the LA Times, a number of places.
He wrote, published some of my work.
Yeah, no. So I think he and Chris Hedges are both kind of weather vanes of the left, and both of them I know read Devil's Chessboard, my book, and were quite influenced and taken by it. And both of them had dismissed JFK as a Cold Warrior until then. So I think that book, and I've been on their shows, and I know Chris. I did a book with Chris, and I know Bob Shear quite well. So they did move as a result, and I think in the proper way. I think they're reevaluating that history now. I think it's important, very important, to understand that period and historically, and how Kennedy broke from the orthodoxy in this country, the imperial orthodoxy, and why that was so significant. Because I think Bobby Kennedy Jr. has done the same thing. And I think he's pilloried every day in the press. He's smeared even more than Bernie. 4, 5, 6, 7 articles a day that say the same thing. He's a crazy anti-vaxxer. He's a conspiracy theorist. He's a nut. He deserves to have nuts at his rallies who threaten him. I mean, you wrote about this, Aaron, this week. This guy in Los Angeles who apparently was unhinged, and they said Bobby somehow attracted this kind of crazy element because he's crazy himself. They're blaming the victim. It's outrageous. The Daily Beast, anybody who calls itself a legitimate publication, runs articles like that. That's propaganda. That's not reporting.
Yeah, I think it was either the New York Times or Life magazine years ago that said about Malcolm X, someone came out of that darkness that he spawned and killed him. And it's like these people they're beneath contempt. It's really horrendous.
Either it's lazy, stupid journalism, it could be ignorant journalism, or it's worse. It's something sponsored.
Yeah, I tend to think that they know what their editors want. And so they, it makes all the incentives are there for it to be sort of one voice that we get of, cancel this guy. We got to cancel him. Now, so speaking of being really canceled from this mortal coil, we lost a senator recently, David, and I think we should talk about this before we wrap up here. So you've written would you call it an obituary, a tribute, or how would you describe your recent piece on the occasion of Dianne Feinstein's passing?
Well, look, I knew Dianne Feinstein personally out here in San Francisco. She was obviously a major figure, and I'm very involved in the city politics. It's a weird city, man. It's given rise to a lot of Democratic politicians at the national level. Feinstein, Pelosi, Kamala Harris, Gavin Newsom. Others have come out of this crazy cauldron of San Francisco politics. So yes, I knew Di-Fi, as we call her out here. But I'll remember her most. I wrote, you're right, an opinion piece. It'll appear in the New York Times tomorrow about her. I remember her most as mayor, and I'm definitely to her left. I was a critic of hers in many ways. She opposed rent control for vacant housing. She opposed some pro-gay legislation. She was seen as too conservative, too starchy, too uptight for San Francisco, a city like us. She was the Margaret Dumont, if you know your Hollywood history, to the city of Marx Brothers. But I think the assassinations of Mayor George Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk in November of 1978 gave her a second wind. She was about to retire at that point from politics. She'd just come back from a trek in the Himalayas with her future husband, Dick Blum, and she decided she was unelectable as mayor of the city. But the assassinations changed everything. And as I say in this opinion piece for the Times, she was not the mayor we wanted, but she was the mayor we needed. It turned out to be, with her strong hand on the rudder, her kind of iron way that she ruled, just what the city that was coming apart, frankly, then needed. President Reagan, among others, Pat Buchanan, conservative activist, called the AIDS epidemic, which was rising quickly, particularly in this city, God's wrath, the nature's revenge on gay men. And President Reagan largely ignored the AIDS epidemic. The city of San Francisco under Mayor Feinstein spent more money on AIDS than the entire federal government in the mid-'80s. Supervisor Harry Brett, who took over Harvey Milk's seat, who was a gay, radical, progressive, a socialist, told me that she was the mayor, and he clashed often with Feinstein, but she was the mayor that we needed. He said she visited the patients, AIDS patients, more often than he did at the hospitals here in San Francisco. So when it came to medical protocol, when it came to making the city function, she was a strong mayor that we needed. I think her record as senator is much more mixed. I'd prefer to think of her in death as the mayor that the city needed. And by the way, the city is undergoing the same kind of chaotic upheaval right now. And we need a better mayor. We need a visionary leader like we had under her. And despite her flaws. So we need someone like that next year. London Breed is up for re-election as mayor. I've been trying to get a progressive to run against her, a strong one, and we'll see if that happens.
I hope so. Breed is pretty terrible. It's just another neoliberal corporate phony. So hopefully things can change for San Francisco. Now, the Feinstein in this during that time period when you had that horrific assassination, that double assassination, she was like, I mean, she was personally involved in that, right? I mean, she saw the victims and such.
Yeah, she went to Harvey Milk, who was her neighbor at the city hall, the neighboring office. She went to him. She found him dead on the floor. She put her finger on his pulse to see if he was still alive, and she found the bullet hole. She stuck her finger, slipped inside one of his bullet holes in his body. There's blood on her skirt when she met with the hastily assembled press right after the killings from Harvey. So she saw more of, I think, as you said later in the Senate, what assault rifles, what guns can do to people. She saw it personally.
Yeah, I mean that's that I'd never really had any kind of positive inclination towards her at all. I did feel a little bit of sympathy for her as you described those episodes in the book, the assassination and also the AIDS crisis. I think her connection to the military industrial complex through her husband and so on she was ultimately kind of corrupted by establishment power, but they had her on autopilot. That's why I guess she could be a senator even when she was basically at death's door, because she's just on autopilot.
She was very close, too close to national security during her time in Washington as a senator. And she always, even here, loved the Blue Angel fly over in San Francisco. She thought that was really exciting. I find it very annoying when the Navy dive bombs the city once a year during Fleet Week. She loved it though. So yeah, she was soft from any uniform. She was too close to national security, although she did, as you know, speak out against CIA torture during the War on Terror. And they made a movie about that, her efforts to hold the CIA accountable with the CIA spying on her. So, she
and they hack her computers.
They hacked her computers, yeah, to try and get at what she was looking at as senator. So, it was a double-edged sword. But by and large, you're right. She was too closely aligned with national security. She believed the best of them, these people, and we see the dark.
Yeah, this is true.
Mm. It'd be interesting to see what she, I don't know, what she would have. I don't know. She clearly wasn't there at the end, but it'd be interesting to see what she would have thought of herself and what her and her staff and the Democratic establishment made of her towards the end of her life. I mean, it's got to be a harrowing thing to experience to the extent that you're experiencing it, I think.
Well, look, I wrote a column for the Chronicle out here, the San Francisco Chronicle. I briefly was a columnist there before my stroke in 2017. And I said, Dianne Feinstein shouldn't run again. She's going to be 85 in 2018 when she ran for the Senate again for re-election. That's ridiculous. I mean, the cover of the New Yorker has all these old guys on walkers, Biden, McConnell, Pelosi. I mean, that's who runs Washington, are these guys pushing 80 or over 80. So yes, I think she was way too old at 85 to run for re-election. She should never have been allowed. She was going to die in office. She did die in office. I think there should be an age cutoff, 75 or something. But I think a lot of Washington, a lot of the wheels of power are operated by geriatrics. I say this as an old guy, by the way.
It's a good metaphor, I think, for this time period anyway. The fact that we have all of these people who are so old and decrepit and they're just on autopilot like she was. I mean, to me, the symbolism of that and the U.S. empire, which is about it's about a lifespan of a human being, really. It's about 80 years now, right? When was Hiroshima bombed? About 80,
Yeah.
almost 80 years ago. So this is like it's somehow the perfect metaphor for us as an empire that is going to die just like all empires. And some of our imperial apparatchiks, they're in the same boat. And we should pause and reflect on this, that all things pass and all empires pass. And do we want to take the world with us? So
Well said. Well said.
all right. David Talbot, thank you very much. And Bryce Green, it's always a pleasure, gentlemen.
Good to see
Absolutely.
you, Bryce and Aaron. Thank you very much.
Devil's Chess Club is an American Exception production. Special thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode and to Casey Moore for the graphics. To get first access to episodes of Devil's Chess Club, please subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. Subscribers get access not only to Devil's Chess Club, but to the rest of the American Exception podcast catalog. Mini episodes, 150 and counting, dealing with the deep, dark politics of U.S. empire. After that, you can find episodes on Rockfin Premium before they eventually get posted to YouTube on a new Devil's Chess Club playlist on the American Exception YouTube channel. I want you all to know that the plan for this episode was for it to be about an hour and change altogether. But for both sessions with Bryce and then with David and Bryce, we just had more things to discuss. That to me is a good sign, and I hope that you all appreciated these discussions as well. Friends, remember that even when things look grim, every empire eventually loses on the devil's chessboard.